The cold CEO's son rejected every nanny until he accepted me and my baby. Now we're their family. The rain had been falling since sunset, thin and relentless, as if Seoul itself was too tired to cry properly. Inside a small convenience store tucked between taller buildings, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The warmth from the heater barely reached the corners. Behind the counter stood Han Jaewon, swaying gently from side to side with a baby strapped to his chest. The baby, his baby, was warm and heavy against his heart. "Shoo, it's okay," Jaewon whispered, barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. "Just a little longer." The infant hiccuped, tiny fingers curling into the fabric of Jaewon's hoodie. A customer near the instant noodles glanced over with mild irritation. Babies shouldn't be in places like this. Jaewon bowed his head instinctively. "I'm sorry." He always said sorry. To customers. To managers. To strangers. To the world. From the back room, the manager's voice cut sharply through the air. "Jaewon. If customers complain again, don't bother coming tomorrow." "Yes, sir," Jaewon replied quickly. He didn't argue. He never did. The baby began to fuss louder. Jaewon's heart tightened immediately. He bounced gently, patting the tiny back with careful rhythm. Every cry felt like a personal failure. He glanced at the time on his phone. 1:47 a.m. Another notification popped up. Application rejected. Then another. Application rejected. He didn't even feel disappointed anymore. The ache had dulled into something quieter. Something heavier. Jaewon lowered his head and pressed his lips to the soft crown of his baby's hair. "It's okay," he whispered. "Appa will figure it out. I promise." Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the city. Morning came too quickly. Sunlight filtered weakly through the thin curtains of Jaewon's tiny rooftop apartment. The room was barely large enough for two people, and yet it held everything they owned. A thin mattress on the floor, stacked tins of formula, neatly folded second-hand clothes, a stroller wedged into the corner. Jaewon sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully mixing formula with warm water. His movements were slow but precise. Practiced. Across from him, his baby, Seo Yubin, lay kicking happily on a worn blanket, unaware of the weight his existence placed on the world. Jaewon looked at him and smiled. "You slept well, didn't you?" he murmured. He lifted Yubin gently, brushing their noses together. The baby squealed, delighted, and Jaewon's chest tightened with love so fierce it almost hurt. Then his phone buzzed. He nearly ignored it out of habit. But something made him glance down. A new message. Elite Care Domestic Agency. Interview confirmed, 10 a.m. Jaewon froze. Elite Care wasn't just any agency. It was the agency. The one people whispered about online. The one that only handled wealthy clients, celebrities, executives, politicians. For a moment he thought it must be a mistake. He reread it. Once. Twice. 3 times. It didn't disappear. Slowly, disbelief turned into something fragile and dangerous. Hope. He laughed softly, eyes stinging. "Yubin," he whispered, holding his baby closer, "Appa might finally get a real job." The baby babbled back as if agreeing. The Elite Care Agency building looked like a luxury hotel. Marble floors. Glass walls. Quiet professionalism in every corner. Jaewon felt painfully out of place the moment he stepped inside. Other applicants sat neatly dressed, resumes in hand. When they noticed the baby carrier on Jaewon's chest, whispers spread quickly. "Is he serious? He brought a child? This isn't a daycare." Jaewon kept his eyes down. He had long learned how to pretend not to hear. A recruiter called him into a private office. She was middle-aged, impeccably dressed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She studied his file, then looked up at him. "You're applying for the Kong household." Jaewon nodded. "Yes." Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise. Something closer to pity. 12 candidates have failed before you," she said calmly. "Highly qualified professionals. Experienced caregivers. None lasted more than a week." Jaewon's fingers tightened around the strap of Yubin's carrier. "The child," she continued, "hasn't emotionally accepted anyone in over a year." Jaewon hesitated, then asked quietly, "Why?" The recruiter studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because he doesn't trust anyone." Jaewon looked down at his baby who was busy chewing on his own fist. "I understand that," he said softly. The recruiter's gaze sharpened. "Why do you think you'll be different?" Jaewon thought about it carefully. Then he shook his head. "I don't think I'm different," he admitted. "But I know what it feels like to be unwanted." Silence filled the office. After a long pause, she finally said, You'll have one trial day. The Kong residence looked like something out of another world. Tall gates. Perfect stonework. A garden too immaculate to be real. Jaiwan stood outside for several seconds before the gates opened automatically. His hands were trembling. He adjusted Yubin's carrier and stepped inside. The inside of the house was even colder than the outside, sterile, elegant, untouched. No laughter. No warmth. No signs of a child. Then he saw him. Kang Taehyun. Tall. Impeccably dressed. Expressionless. Standing near the window like he belonged to the architecture itself. When Taehyun turned around, his gaze was sharp enough to make Jaiwan forget how to breathe. "You're late," the man said flatly. "I'm sorry," Jaiwan said quickly. "The bus was delayed." Excuses are unnecessary. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Taehyun's gaze dropped slowly, to the baby. "You brought a child." "Yes." Jaiwan's heart clenched. "I have no one else to watch him." Pause. "This is not a daycare position." "I understand. If that disqualifies me, I'll leave." Jaiwan meant it. He'd learned not to cling to things that didn't want him. He began to turn away. But Taehyun spoke again. "You have until evening." Jaiwan looked up, startled. "If my son rejects you like the others," Taehyun said coldly, "you leave." It wasn't kindness, but it was a chance. "Thank you," Jaiwan whispered. Taehyun had already turned away. Minji's room was beautiful. Expensive. Carefully curated. But it didn't feel like a child's room. No chaos. No joy. No warmth. In the corner, half hidden behind a bookshelf, sat a small boy clutching a green dinosaur plush tightly to his chest. He didn't look up when they entered. He didn't move. "This is Han Jaiwan," Taehyun said neutrally. "He'll be staying today." No response. Not a word. Not a glance. Taehyun turned to Jaiwan. "If he throws anything, dodge." Then he left. The door closed softly behind him. Jaiwan stood there, suddenly aware that this was the real interview. He didn't approach the boy. Didn't speak to him. Instead, he slowly sat on the floor, far enough away to give space. Yubin stirred slightly in his carrier. Jaiwan adjusted him gently and whispered, "We should be polite, right? We're guests." He bowed the baby's head playfully. "Say hello." Yubin babbled happily. For the first time, Minji's eyes flickered toward them. Just briefly. Jaiwan pretended not to notice. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic ring toy. One. He rolled it gently across the floor. It stopped halfway between them. He didn't push it closer. Didn't look expectant. He simply waited. Silence stretched. A minute passed. Then, slowly, hesitantly, a small hand reached out from behind the bookshelf. Minji's fingers touched the toy, and just as gently he pushed it back. Not far. Not confidently. But he pushed it. Jaiwan's breath caught. He didn't react outwardly. Didn't rush. Didn't smile too brightly. He only rolled it back again. A simple game. But inside his chest, something fragile bloomed. Outside the door, unseen by either of them, Kang Taehyun stood perfectly still. Watching. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't managing. He wasn't controlling. He was simply observing, as his son inched closer to someone for the first time in over a year. And something deep within him shifted. The house was too quiet in the mornings. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that felt carefully preserved, like silence had become a rule, not a comfort. Jaiwan noticed it the moment he woke up. He had barely slept, curled awkwardly on the edge of the guest room bed with Yubin nestled against his chest. The unfamiliar luxury of the mattress, the thick blankets, the scent of expensive detergent, none of it had brought him rest. He'd woken repeatedly, afraid that at any moment someone would tell him to leave, that this had all been a mistake. But morning came without interruption. Soft light filtered through the tall windows. Somewhere down the hall, a faint sound echoed. A small footstep. Jaiwan held his breath. The door to the guest room wasn't fully closed. Through the narrow gap, he saw a sliver of the hallway, and just beyond it, a tiny shadow lingering. He didn't move. Didn't speak. He only pretended to be asleep. After a long moment, the shadow disappeared. Jaiwan finally exhaled. Breakfast turned out to be a disaster. The kitchen was massive, spotless, and intimidating. Everything gleamed, countertops untouched, appliances that looked too expensive to operate. Jaiwan stood in the middle of it, holding Yubin on one hip, unsure where to begin. A housekeeper briefly passed by, offering only a polite nod before retreating quickly, as though interaction itself was discouraged. Jaiwan found ingredients in the fridge, Organic eggs, imported fruit, artisan bread. Too much. Too fancy. Too unfamiliar. He cooked anyway. Not gourmet. Not elegant. Just simple food. Soft scrambled eggs. Toast cut into small triangles. Warm milk. Sliced strawberries arranged carefully on a plate. He hesitated, then added something extra. Using the edge of a spoon, he shaped the eggs into a clumsy little bear face. It was childish. But children like childish things. He carried the tray toward the dining area. Minjae was already there. Sitting perfectly straight. Hands folded. Expression blank. Like a small porcelain doll. Jaiwan paused several steps away. "Good morning," he said gently, keeping his voice low. No response. Jaiwan approached slowly and placed the tray on the table, not directly in front of Minjae, but close enough that the boy could choose whether to pull it closer or not. Then Jaiwan stepped back. He sat at the far end of the table instead, bouncing Yubin lightly. Silence filled the space again. Out of the corner of his eye, Jaiwan watched Minjae stare down at the plate. The little bear face. The strawberries. The toast. He didn't touch anything. Not at first. Jaiwan didn't push. Didn't encourage. Didn't ask. He only began whispering to Yubin instead. "You know, when Appa was little," Jaiwan murmured softly, "I liked my eggs like this. But no one ever made them for me." He didn't mean to say that aloud. But the words slipped out anyway. Minji's fingers twitched slightly on the table. Barely noticeable. But Jaiwan noticed. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Minjae reached for the toast. Jaiwan didn't look. Pretended not to see. Let the moment belong entirely to the child. By the time the plate was half empty, Jaiwan felt like crying. He didn't. Later that morning, Jaiwan sat on the living room floor with Yubin, sorting through a small pile of toys he'd brought from home. They were cheap. Well-loved. Slightly scuffed. But they were familiar. Yubin grabbed a soft plush rabbit and tried to shove it into his mouth. Jaiwan laughed quietly. No, that's not food." From the hallway, Minjae watched. Half hidden behind the wall again. Always keeping distance. Jaiwan noticed the shadow this time. He still didn't call attention to it. Instead, he began playing with Yubin more animatedly. Making the rabbit hop. Giving it a silly voice. "Oh no. Mr. Rabbit is late for work." Yubin squealed in delight. Jaiwan exaggerated his expressions, making the baby giggle louder. A soft sound came from the hallway. Not a word. But something else. A breathy exhale. Almost like a tiny laugh. Jaiwan's heart clenched painfully. He kept going. 10 minutes later, he rolled one of Yubin's colorful balls gently across the floor. It stopped near the hallway. He didn't look. Didn't check. But a moment later it rolled back. Not far. Not confidently. But enough. Jaiwan smiled down at Yubin instead of toward Minjae. "Looks like someone wants to play with you." Kang Taehyun watched everything. Not openly. Never openly. But from the second-floor corridor, from behind partially open doors, from the reflection of darkened windows. He watched. He noticed things no one else did. How Jaiwan never forced eye contact. How he always gave Minjae space. How he spoke to his baby instead of at Minjae, allowing the boy to listen without pressure. How Minji's rigid posture softened just a little more every hour. It unsettled Taehyun. Not because it was bad. But because it worked. Nothing had worked before. Doctors. Specialists. Therapists. Professional caregivers with perfect resumes. All failures. Yet this young man with tired eyes and second-hand clothes was succeeding. Without trying. That night, Taehyun stood outside Minji's room as the boy prepared for bed. Through the door he heard something unfamiliar. A soft voice. Jaiwan's. "He's asleep now," Jaiwan whispered as if sensing Taehyun's presence. "He likes being tucked in." There was a pause. "He didn't say it," Jaiwan added quietly. "But I think he likes being checked on." Taehyun didn't respond. But he didn't leave either. Later, when the house had fully settled into silence, Jaiwan sat on the couch, exhausted. Yubin slept peacefully against his chest. He stared down at the baby, thoughts heavy. How long could this last? How long before they decided he wasn't good enough? How long before he had to leave, again? He didn't hear the small footsteps until they stopped in front of him. Jaiwan looked up slowly. Minjae stood there. Closer than ever before. Not hiding. Not retreating. Just standing. Watching. Jaiwan didn't speak. Didn't move. He only offered a small, gentle smile. Minjae hesitated. Then, with trembling uncertainty, he reached out and gently touched the edge of Yubin's blanket. Just for a second. Then he pulled his hand back, startled by his own bravery, and fled down the hallway. Jaiwan sat frozen long after. A hand pressed over his mouth. Tears burning behind his eyes. Down the hall, Kang Taehyun witnessed the end of it. Saw his son run back to his room. Saw the way Jaiwan remained still as though afraid to break something sacred. Saw the way his shoulders trembled slightly. For the first time, Taehyun wondered something he had never allowed himself to consider. Not is this nanny suitable? But how did we live before him? The first word came without ceremony. No dramatic moment. No announcement. No audience. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, when the sky outside was pale and undecided, and the house felt softer than it had any right to. Jaiwan was sitting on the floor near the sofa, Yubin sprawled on a soft blanket beside him. The baby had discovered his feet and was currently engaged in the important business of trying to eat them. Jaiwan watched him with gentle amusement, occasionally reaching out to rescue a sock. Behind them, almost soundlessly, Min-jae had approached. He didn't hide behind the doorway anymore. Not really. Now he lingered a few steps away, close enough that his presence felt intentional. Jaiwan never pointed it out. He simply made space. He picked up one of Yubin's toys, a small yellow duck that squeaked when squeezed, and pressed it gently. Squeak. Yubin startled, then burst into delighted giggles. Jaiwan laughed softly. You like that, huh? Squeak. More laughter. Min-jae watched, his dark eyes serious, observant. Then, slowly he sat down on the carpet. Not close but not far either. Jaiwan's heart stuttered. He kept his voice calm. This duck is very noisy, he said conversationally, as if Min-jae were just another presence in the room. I think he wants attention. He rolled the duck across the floor. It stopped between them. Min-jae stared at it for a long time. Then he picked it up. He didn't squeak it. Just held it. Yubin noticed immediately and let out an indignant babble, arms flailing. That's his, Jaiwan murmured to Min-jae gently, not as a command but as an explanation. But, maybe he can share if you ask nicely. He didn't expect anything to happen. He was used to speaking into silence. Min-jae's fingers tightened slightly around the duck. Then, almost inaudible, as if the word had to pass through too many walls before it could escape. Hyung. Jaiwan froze. The room didn't change. The world didn't stop. But something inside Jaiwan did. For a heartbeat he wondered if he had imagined it. A trick of hope. A cruel echo. He looked at Min-jae carefully. The boy's gaze had dropped to the floor as if ashamed of the sound he had made. Jaiwan didn't react outwardly. Didn't gasp. Didn't rush forward. He only smiled gently as though this was the most natural thing in the world. That's right, he said softly. If that's what you want to call me. Min-jae's fingers loosened on the duck. Yubin let out a triumphant squeal and immediately reclaimed it by flailing toward it with impressive determination. Min-jae watched him with something new in his eyes. Not fear. Not caution. But curiosity. Taehyun heard the word later. Not directly. He heard it in the way the house felt different when he came home. Something subtle had shifted. Like the air after rain. He found Jaiwan in the living room, gently rocking Yubin in his arms. Min-jae sat beside them on the sofa now, actually on the sofa, quietly flipping through a picture book. They looked natural together. Like a scene that belonged. Taehyun stood in the doorway longer than he intended to. Jaiwan noticed him first, of course. He always did. He lifted his head slightly. Their eyes met. For once, Taehyun didn't immediately look away. Did anything change today? He asked neutrally. Jaiwan hesitated. Then he nodded once. He spoke. Taehyun's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. What did he say? Jaiwan glanced toward Min-jae, who was pretending very hard to be absorbed in his book. He called me Hyung. The word hung between them. Taehyun had spent months, years, waiting to hear his son speak to someone again. He had imagined the moment 1,000 times. He had never imagined it would be this quiet. This fragile. He looked at Min-jae. The boy didn't look back. But he didn't leave either. Taehyun nodded once as though acknowledging a report in a boardroom. Understood. He turned and left the room. But later that night, alone in his office, he stood by the window with a glass of untouched water and stared down at the city far below. Young. Not Appa. Not father. But someone close. Someone safe. Someone Min-jae had chosen. Taehyun didn't know how to name the feeling that settled in his chest. He only knew it wasn't something he could ignore anymore. The storm arrived without warning. By evening the wind had picked up, rattling the tall windows. Rain lashed against the glass like thrown pebbles. Thunder rolled so deeply it seemed to shake the walls themselves. The power went out shortly after. The house plunged into darkness. For several seconds everything was still. Then came the sound. A sharp intake of breath. Small. Panicked. Jaiwan was on his feet instantly. He found his phone, turned on the flashlight, and hurried toward Minji's room. He knocked gently once before opening the door. Minjae? The boy was sitting upright in bed, clutching his dinosaur plush so tightly his knuckles were white. His eyes were wide. Terrified. Jaiwan's heart clenched painfully. "It's okay," he said softly, keeping his voice low, soothing. "It's just a storm." Minjae didn't respond. But his gaze never left Jaiwan. Jaiwan moved closer, slow and careful, and sat on the floor beside the bed. "The lights will come back," he murmured. "They always do." Another crack of thunder split the sky. Minjae flinched violently. Without thinking, Jaiwan reached out and gently covered the boy's hand with his own. Minjae didn't pull away. So Jaiwan stayed. He began to speak softly, not forcing conversation, just letting his voice exist in the darkness. "When I was little," he said quietly, "I was scared of storms too." Minji's grip on the dinosaur loosened just slightly. "I used to count the seconds between the thunder and the rain," Jaiwan continued. "It made it feel smaller. Like something I could understand." He counted softly when the next thunder rolled. 1, 2, 3. The storm didn't feel quite as overwhelming anymore. Not with someone sitting beside him. In the hallway outside, unseen, Taehyun stood completely still. Listening. They ended up in the living room. Not because Jaiwan planned it. But because Yubin woke up crying, unsettled by the darkness, and Jaiwan couldn't bear to leave Minjae alone again. So he gathered them both. Yubin against his chest. Minjae at his side. 3 small heartbeats pressed into the darkness. They sat on the couch, illuminated only by phone light and the occasional lightning flash outside. Jaiwan told them a story. Not a fairy tale. Not something polished. Just pieces of his own childhood, carefully softened. About wanting warmth. About learning to endure. About hoping even when hope felt foolish. Minjae listened without interrupting. Yubin eventually fell back asleep. And Jaiwan kept talking, not realizing that every word was threading something invisible but powerful through the room. In the hallway, Taehyun listened. To Jaiwan's voice. To the honesty in it. To the gentleness he had never known how to offer. And for the first time, Taehyun felt something inside him begin to fracture. Not painfully. But like ice melting. The power returned close to midnight. The lights flickered on softly, restoring the world to its usual sharp clarity. Jaiwan blinked, disoriented. Minjae had fallen asleep against his side. Yubin was a warm weight on his chest. Jaiwan didn't move. He didn't want to disturb the moment. He didn't realize someone was watching. Taehyun stood a few steps away. Looking at them. Not with calculation. Not with analysis. But with something dangerously close to tenderness. He picked up the blanket from the nearby armchair. Quietly, carefully, as though afraid of breaking the scene. He draped it over them both. Jaiwan stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. Their gazes met. Just for a second. Then Taehyun stepped back, expression unreadable once more. "Sleep," he said quietly. "You'll need your strength tomorrow." It wasn't an order. It wasn't cold. It was almost considerate. Jaiwan nodded faintly. "Good night." Taehyun left without another word. But the air he left behind felt changed. By morning, Minjae would barely acknowledge what had happened. By afternoon, Taehyun would return to his controlled silence. By evening, everything would look the same again. But underneath the surface, something irreversible had begun. Trust had taken root. Attachment had formed. And emotions neither of them knew how to name had started to grow quietly in the space between them. The Kong residence had always been orderly. Too orderly. Every movement scheduled. Every interaction measured. Every emotion carefully contained. Jaiwan had begun to change that without even realizing it. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just in small, almost invisible ways. A blanket left on the couch because Minjae liked sitting there now. A bowl of cut fruit in the kitchen instead of untouched luxury desserts. Soft humming in the halls late at night when Yubin wouldn't sleep. The house had begun to feel lived in. And not everyone appreciated that. Yoon Era arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. No announcement. No appointment. Just the confident click of heels against marble. Jaiwan was in the living room, gently rocking Yubin while Minjae sat beside him, lining up toy blocks in careful rows. He looked up at the unfamiliar sound. The woman standing near the entrance was striking in the way people who knew they were beautiful often were. Perfect hair. Expensive coat. lipstick too sharp to be accidental. She smiled at Jaiwan. Not warmly, not kindly, just politely enough to be dangerous. You must be the new nanny, she said. Jaiwan stood immediately out of habit. Yes, I'm Han Jaiwan. Her gaze dropped to the baby. Something flickered in her eyes. Still bringing your child to work, I see. Jaiwan's shoulders stiffened. He's quiet. He won't be a problem. Era's smile widened just slightly. That's what you think. Minjae had gone completely still. Jaiwan noticed instantly. He shifted subtly closer to the boy without thinking. Era followed his gaze and noticed Minjae for the first time. Her expression softened instantly, but the softness felt artificial, performed. Minjae, she cooed, crouching down. Do you remember me? Minjae didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't respond. Era's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She reached out as if to touch his shoulder. Minjae flinched. Jaiwan stepped forward gently but firmly. He doesn't like sudden contact. Era looked up at him, eyes cool. I used to work here, you know? Jaiwan froze. You did. For 6 months. She straightened. Longer than anyone else lasted. 6 months. That meant Minjae had rejected her too. Era tilted her head slightly. It must be exhausting, pretending to be perfect all the time. Jaiwan blinked, confused. I'm not pretending. Era studied him carefully. Then she laughed softly. That's worse. Taehyun arrived home earlier than expected. He knew something was wrong the moment he stepped inside. The air felt tight. Minji's presence felt withdrawn. Jaiwan's voice was absent. He followed instinct rather than logic. It led him to the living room. Era was sitting elegantly on the sofa. Minjae stood several steps away, arms wrapped around himself, expression blank. Jaiwan stood near the window, posture tense. Taehyun stopped. Era, he said flatly. She brightened instantly. Taehyun. She stood, moving toward him with practiced familiarity. You didn't tell me you hired someone new already. I didn't tell you anything because it isn't your concern. Her smile faltered for just a moment before recovering. I heard you've been struggling. Taehyun's gaze flicked briefly to Minjae, then back to her. We're fine. Era glanced toward Jaiwan. Her tone sharpened. You call this fine? Letting an unqualified single parent bring his baby into your home? Into your son's life. The words were sharp. Calculated. Jaiwan flinched before he could stop himself. Silence dropped heavily across the room. Taehyun's voice when he spoke was low. Watch your tone. Era laughed lightly. I'm just being realistic. You're risking your reputation. The company's reputation. People talk. I don't care what people talk about. Era stared at him. Since when? Taehyun didn't answer. Instead he looked at Jaiwan. Jaiwan's eyes were lowered, hands clenched tightly around Yubin's blanket. Minjae shifted closer to him. Almost instinctively. Era noticed. So did Taehyun. Something cold and sharp passed through him. Era's gaze followed theirs. Understanding dawned slowly, and then curdled into something uglier. You're getting attached, she said quietly. Both of you. Taehyun's expression didn't change. That's inappropriate, she continued. Unprofessional. He took one slow step toward her. Leave. The word was calm. Absolute. Era blinked. What? You are no longer welcome here. Her eyes widened. You're choosing him over me? Over what's proper. Taehyun didn't hesitate. Yes. The word landed heavily. Decisively. Jaiwan's head snapped up. Minji's fingers tightened in the fabric of Jaiwan's sleeve. Era stared at Taehyun as if seeing him for the first time. You'll regret this, she said quietly. Taehyun didn't respond. She left without another word. The door closed softly behind her. The house felt too large afterward. Too quiet. Jaiwan retreated to the guest room that night with Yubin, emotions tangled and heavy. He sat on the edge of the bed long after the baby had fallen asleep. He shouldn't be here. He didn't belong here. He was causing problems. He stood slowly and began packing his small bag. Just a few clothes. Yubin's things. Nothing that would be missed. A quiet knock sounded on the door. Jaiwan froze. Come in, he said softly. The door opened. Minjae stood there. Small. Silent. Watching. Jaiwan's heart clenched painfully. I'm just organizing, he lied gently. Minjae didn't move. Didn't blink. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately. Then he reached out and took hold of the strap of Jaiwan's bag. Not hard. Not aggressive. Just holding. Jaiwan's breath caught. Minjae. The boy looked up at him. His eyes were wide, uncertain, vulnerable. His lips parted. The word came out barely louder than a breath. Don't go. Jaiwan's world shattered quietly. He crouched immediately, setting the bag aside. I'm here, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere right now. Minjae didn't relax fully. But he didn't let go of Jaiwan's sleeve either. In the doorway behind them, unseen, Taehyun stood completely still. And for the first time in his life, he understood something with perfect clarity. This wasn't about employment anymore. This wasn't about convenience. This was about his son's heart. And dangerously about his own. It started with a fever. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sudden. Just a soft, restless whimper in the middle of the night that pulled Jaiwan from sleep like a thread drawn too tightly. Yubin's tiny body felt warmer than usual. At first, Jaiwan told himself not to panic. Babies got fevers. It happened. He knew that. He had read enough parenting articles at 3 in the morning to fill an entire library. But when the baby's breath turned uneven and his skin felt hot against Jaiwan's chest, fear crept in anyway. Real fear. The kind that hollowed him out. He fumbled for the thermometer with shaking hands. 38.9 degrees Celsius. Too high. His throat went dry. It's okay, he whispered automatically, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Yubin or himself. Appa's here. Yubin stirred weakly, letting out a soft, pitiful sound that nearly broke him. Jaiwan didn't think. He only moved. He grabbed the diaper bag, changed into the first clothes he could find, wrapped Yubin tightly in a blanket and rushed out of the room. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay still. The hallway lights flicked on. Taehyun stood at the end of the corridor, already dressed, already awake. As though he had sensed something. What happened? He asked quietly. Jaiwan froze for half a second, startled. Fever, he said quickly. I think I should take him to the hospital. Taehyun stepped closer instantly. One look at the baby's flushed face was enough. I'll drive. There was no hesitation. No discussion. Only action. The city at night blurred into streaks of light outside the car window. Jaiwan sat in the back seat, cradling Yubin tightly against his chest, whispering softly, endlessly. Taehyun drove in silence. But his hands were clenched on the steering wheel. Too tight. The hospital was bright. Too bright. Too clean. Too clinical. Nurses moved efficiently. Doctors asked calm questions. Machines beeped softly. Jaiwan answered everything automatically, voice shaking only slightly. How long had the fever lasted? Was the baby eating normally? Any previous conditions? He hated how small he felt standing there. How easily he could be dismissed. Taehyun never left their side. Not once. He didn't touch. Didn't interfere. Didn't take over. He simply stayed. A quiet presence at Jaiwan's shoulder. Unmoving. Unleaving. It mattered more than either of them acknowledged. The diagnosis was mild. A viral infection. Common. Treatable. Keep him hydrated. Monitor the fever. He'll recover in a few days. The doctor smiled gently. You're doing well. Jaiwan nearly cried at the words. They ended up sitting in the hospital corridor while Yubin slept in Jaiwan's arms. The world felt paused there. Muted. Suspended between fluorescent lights and distant footsteps. Jaiwan stared down at the baby's peaceful face, exhaustion heavy in his bones. I was scared, he admitted quietly. Taehyun looked at him. I know. The simplicity of the response undid him slightly. Jaiwan hesitated, then said the thing he had never said aloud. I'm always scared, he confessed. That something will happen. That I won't be enough. That I'll lose him. Silence stretched between them. Then Taehyun spoke, his voice low. I don't know how to be warm, he said. Not instinctively. Jaiwan looked up. I know how to provide. How to protect materially. But not, he paused, searching for the right word. Emotionally. Jaiwan studied him quietly. Then he said softly, You're here. Taehyun blinked slightly. That's how you start. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't poetic. But they landed heavily. The nurse called Jaiwan's name. As Jaiwan stood, his hand brushed against Taehyun's. It was accidental. Barely a touch. But neither of them pulled away immediately. The moment stretched. Unspoken. Unnamed. Then Jaiwan stepped back, flustered, heart racing. Taehyun's expression remained composed. But something had shifted behind his eyes. When they returned to the house, dawn was just beginning to soften the sky. Minjae was waiting. Sitting on the sofa. Fully dressed. Eyes wide. He looked smaller than ever. Jaiwan froze in the doorway. Minjae? Why are you awake? The boy stood immediately, eyes darting to the baby. Jaiwan stepped closer, heart tight. He's okay, he said gently. Just a little sick. Min-jae hesitated. Then he reached out carefully and touched the edge of Yubin's blanket. As if confirming reality. Yubin stirred slightly but didn't wake. Min-jae exhaled quietly. Relief. Pure. Undisguised. Taehyun watched from behind them. Everything in his chest felt unfamiliar. Grandmother Kang arrived later that morning. Without warning. Without apology. Elegant as ever. Sharp-eyed. Impossible to deceive. Her gaze swept across the living room. The blanket on the couch, the scattered toys, the quiet closeness between the three of them. She didn't miss anything. So, she said calmly, this is the chaos everyone's been whispering about. Jaiwan froze, immediately bowing deeply. I'm sorry. She raised a hand, silencing him. Then she stepped closer and studied him more carefully. You look tired, she observed. Good. That means you care. Jaiwan blinked, confused. She glanced toward Taehyun. You, she said coolly, have never looked more alive. Taehyun didn't respond. She looked between them again. Then her gaze fell to Min-jae, who had shifted closer to Jaiwan without realizing it. A slow, knowing smile curved her lips. You already look like a family, she said simply. The words settled into the room like something inevitable. Jaiwan's heart stuttered. Taehyun didn't contradict her. He didn't agree either. But he didn't deny it. And somehow that felt louder than any confession. That night, long after the house had fallen quiet again, Jaiwan sat beside Yubin's crib, watching the baby sleep. Taehyun stood in the doorway. You should rest, he said quietly. Jaiwan smiled faintly. In a minute. Taehyun hesitated, then asked, do you regret staying? The question felt heavier than it sounded. Jaiwan thought about it. About the exhaustion. The fear. The uncertainty. The growing attachment he wasn't supposed to feel. Then he looked at Minji's door down the hall. At Yubin's peaceful face. No, he said softly. I don't. Taehyun held his gaze for a long moment. Neither of them looked away first. The line between them, unspoken, fragile, dangerous, trembled quietly. Neither crossed it. Not yet. But both knew now that it existed. The photograph appeared online just after noon. It wasn't scandalous in the way tabloids usually preferred. No secrets exposed. No stolen moments. Just an image. Kang Taehyun stepping out of a private hospital entrance, coat draped over one arm. Han Jaiwan walking beside him, exhaustion etched clearly into his face. A sleeping baby cradled carefully between them. They looked intimate. Not romantically. Not obviously. Just close. Too close according to the world. The caption beneath the photo read, CO Kang Taehyun spotted with mystery partner and child. Secret family? The article spread like wildfire. Speculation bloomed instantly. Jaiwan discovered it by accident. He was sitting on the couch, gently rocking Yubin, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone while Min-jae colored beside him. He didn't usually check social media. Didn't usually read news. But a familiar name caught his eye. Kang Taehyun. He clicked. And his world tilted sideways. His breath left him all at once. There they were. Frozen in time. Exposed to the world. Interpreted without permission. The comments beneath the article were worse. So the cold CEO is human after all. That kid doesn't even look like him. Probably a gold digger. Using a baby to trap a rich man. Disgusting. Jaiwan's hands began to tremble. He didn't notice Min-jae watching him. Didn't notice the way the boy's posture slowly stiffened. All he could hear were the voices from his past, overlapping with the ones on the screen. Unwanted. Inconvenient. A burden. It was happening again. Taehyun heard about it in the middle of a board meeting. A tablet slid quietly across the table toward him. The headline spoke for itself. The room went silent. Investors watched him carefully. Executives waited. Is this true? One of them finally asked. Do you have an explanation? Taehyun stared at the image. At the way Jaiwan's arm was curved instinctively around the baby. At the way their shoulders nearly touched. At how right it looked. Yes, he said calmly. Silence deepened. They are part of my household, he continued. That is all. That's not all the public will assume, another executive said cautiously. This could affect shareholder confidence. Taehyun lifted his gaze slowly. Then he said something none of them expected. Then let it. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Jaiwan packed quietly. Not in panic. Not in anger. Just with resignation. He folded Yubin's clothes carefully, gathered the toys he had brought from home, slipped Minji's drawing, a clumsy picture of 3 stick figures, between the pages of his notebook. He didn't want to wake anyone. He didn't want a scene. He only knew he couldn't stay. He was already a problem. Now he was a liability. The door to the guest room opened softly. Jaiwan froze. Taehyun stood there. He took in the half-packed bag, the folded clothes, the intent he couldn't mistake. "You're leaving," he said quietly. Jaiwan didn't try to deny it. "I don't want to cause more damage," he said softly. "To your company. To Minjae. To you." Taehyun stepped into the room. "You're not the one causing this." Jaiwan shook his head faintly. "It started because of me." Silence stretched between them. Then Taehyun spoke again, slower this time. "If you leave," he said, "this house will return to what it was." Jaiwan looked up. Empty. The word landed heavier than anything else he could have said. Taehyun's composure, always so perfect, so controlled, finally fractured. Just slightly. "But Minjae," Jaiwan whispered. "He'll be okay. He's stronger now." Taehyun's voice was lower when he answered. "He's stronger because of you." Jaiwan's eyes stung. "You didn't just change him," Taehyun continued. "You changed this house. This routine. This life." He hesitated. Then more quietly still. "You changed me." The words hung between them raw and unguarded. Jaiwan's breath trembled. Taehyun took another step closer. "I don't know how to say this properly," he admitted. "I don't know how to be gentle with things that matter." Jaiwan's voice barely worked. "Then, you don't have to say anything." But Taehyun shook his head once. "This time I do." He reached out slowly, uncertainly, and gently closed Jaiwan's half-packed bag. "Stay," he said. Not as a command. Not as an order. But as something closer to a plea. Jaiwan stared at him, heart breaking open. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Of wanting this too much." Taehyun held his gaze. "So am I." The honesty between them felt unbearable. Without fully thinking, Jaiwan whispered, "Then why?" He didn't finish the question. Because Taehyun leaned forward. The kiss was hesitant. Unsteady. Not practiced. Not passion. Just connection. Just truth. A brief meeting of lips that held everything they hadn't said. When they parted, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. But the line between them, the one they had been afraid to cross, was gone. Replaced by something fragile. Real. Alive. Minjae saw everything. Not clearly. Not fully. Just enough. He stood in the hallway watching the 2 adults who had become his entire world stand close together. He didn't understand all of it. But he understood this. Jaiwan wasn't leaving. And somehow, that mattered more than anything else. By morning, the internet would still be buzzing. The headlines would still speculate. The world would still judge. But inside the Kang residence, something had fundamentally changed. For the first time, no one was pretending anymore. Not about attachment. Not about fear. Not about want. And for the first time, the idea of family no longer felt like something distant. It felt possible. The world did not calm down overnight. If anything, the rumors only grew louder. Articles multiplied. Speculation twisted into theories. Comment sections filled with opinions that had never once considered the feelings of the people behind the image. But inside the Kang residence, something had shifted so deeply that the outside noise no longer felt as powerful. For the first time, the house felt steady. Not perfect. Not free of fear. But grounded. Real. Taehyun stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. He didn't like press conferences. He had always avoided them when possible, delegated them to others, hidden behind official statements and legal teams. This time he had declined every suggestion to let someone else speak for him. He would do it himself. Behind him, in the reflection, Jaiwan stood quietly near the doorway, Yubin balanced on his hip. "You don't have to watch," Taehyun said softly. Jaiwan shook his head. "I want to." Taehyun studied him for a moment as though memorizing the sight. The gentle way he held the baby, the tired but sincere determination in his eyes, the presence that had somehow rewritten the shape of Taehyun's life. He nodded once. "Then I'll be back soon." The press room was crowded. Cameras. Reporters. Bright lights. Endless questions waiting to be thrown. Taehyun stepped onto the stage alone. The room fell silent instantly. He stood behind the podium, hands resting calmly on either side, gaze steady. He did not look nervous. He did not look uncertain. He simply looked resolved. A reporter stood first. "Co Kang, are the rumors true? Do you have a secret family?" Taehyun didn't answer immediately. He looked across the room slowly, meeting gazes without flinching. Then he spoke. Family is not defined by blood alone. The room went still. I grew up believing that responsibility meant distance, he continued calmly. That control meant protection. I was wrong. Cameras clicked rapidly. My son spent years unable to trust anyone. I spent those same years believing I could solve everything with resources alone. He paused briefly. Then more firmly. That changed when someone entered our lives with no expectations, no demands, and no agenda except care. Murmurs rippled across the room. Taehyun didn't stop. Han Jaewon and his child are part of my household. They are part of my son's emotional stability. They are part of my life. He didn't label it. He didn't define it for them. But he didn't hide it either. If the world chooses to criticize that, he said calmly, that is their choice. I will not apologize for protecting what matters to me. No further explanation. No dramatic flourish. No denial. Just truth. He stepped away from the podium. And the room erupted. Jaewon watched everything from the living room television. He sat very still. Yubin gurgled happily in his lap, entirely unconcerned with public opinion. Min-jae stood beside the couch, arms folded tightly, eyes glued to the screen. When the broadcast ended, silence lingered. Jaewon looked down, overwhelmed. He hadn't expected this. Not the clarity. Not the certainty. Not the way Taehyun had chosen them without hesitation. He barely noticed Min-jae tugging gently at his sleeve. What is it? Jaewon asked softly. Min-jae hesitated. Then, quietly, carefully, he said the word he had never said before. Appa. Jaewon's breath left him all at once. He froze. Min-jae looked nervous now, as though he had done something dangerous. Jaewon didn't correct him. He didn't question it. He simply pulled the boy gently into his arms and held him tightly. I'm here, he whispered, voice breaking. I'm right here. Min-jae clung back. Art. As if afraid the moment might disappear if he didn't hold on. Taehyun came home to laughter. Not loud laughter. Not chaotic laughter. But something softer. Something warmer. He paused just inside the entrance. The sight before him was simple. Jaewon on the couch. Yubin sprawled happily across his chest. Min-jae curled beside him, leaning fully into his side without hesitation. A scene so ordinary it felt miraculous. Jaewon looked up when he noticed Taehyun. Their eyes met. Nothing needed to be said. Taehyun walked over quietly. Min-jae glanced up at him. Then hesitantly said, Appa, Hyung is smiling. The words were clumsy. Uneven. Still learning. But Taehyun understood. He sat beside them. Close enough that their shoulders touched. For the first time he didn't move away. Time did not solve everything overnight. There were still hard days. Moments of doubt. Lingering fear. Insecurity that didn't vanish just because love had appeared. But there were also mornings filled with small chaos. Burnt toast. Spilled milk. Min-jae giggling when Yubin tried to crawl after the cat. Taehyun awkwardly attempting to help with homework. Jaewon watching it all with quiet disbelief. This was his life now. Not survival. But living. 1 year later the garden was brighter. Not because the flowers were different. But because the people inside it were. Yubin toddled unsteadily across the grass, squealing with delight. Min-jae chased after him, laughing openly now, unafraid of sound. Taehyun watched from the porch, phone forgotten in his hand. Jaewon stood beside him, arms folded loosely. They're getting faster, Jaewon said softly. Taehyun nodded. They're getting happier. Jaewon glanced at him, heart full in a way that still felt unreal. Do you ever, he hesitated then continued, get scared? Taehyun looked at him. All the time, he admitted. But I no longer want to run from it. He reached out, hesitated only briefly, then laced his fingers gently with Jaewon's. Not hidden. Not secret. Not uncertain. Just there. Jaewon squeezed back. Below them, Min-jae turned suddenly and called out, voice clear and bright. Appa. Hyung. Look. Yubin had taken his first real steps. And in that moment, sunlight warm, laughter ringing, hands still entwined, there was no doubt left. They were no longer broken pieces trying to survive beside each other. They were something whole. Something chosen. Something real. They were home.